Okay, we are now recording, so welcome again, everyone, to the call. I'll just, as always, pop my slides onto the screen if you give me a moment. Okay, so hopefully those should have appeared, I trust. If they haven't, someone shout at me or pop something in the chat and I'll do something about it.
Oh, you can see him.
Good to know. Right, okay, so as always, thank you to DNS OARC for sponsoring the calls, which is much appreciated, particularly after a good time at the OARC 43 meeting in Prague. Gosh, 3 weeks ago now, I think. Seems like months ago, and we're already thinking about the next one in Atlanta in early February, which doesn't seem that far away, surprisingly. But anyway, so this time round, we're complete the trilogy of just looking back at some highlights of meetings. This time being the IETF 121 meeting in Dublin. So. As before, my cunning plan for the call is I'll sort of chip in with a few comments on a few things which I thought were interesting. I'll make it slightly briefer than when we did this after the last ITF meeting, because we ended up spanning 2 calls worth of discussion, although if the discussion burgeons, that's fantastic, but I'll try and make my comments a little briefer than last time round, so genuinely focus on a few of the more interesting things for me. But obviously a reasonable number of people on this call were also present, either in person or remotely, so do feel free to chip in along the way with your views either on the things that I've commented on or other stuff that I've not. Either's fine, and then time permitting we'll look at some of the news headlines, etc., of which there are a lot this week actually. No idea why, so we'll see if we have time to look at some of those as well. Okay, so just for context, a reminder, the meeting, ITF 121, took place at the beginning of November. As always, with a 2-day hackathon, then the sort of meeting proper effectively running for the Monday through Friday. And I mean, I know at one point the ITF sort of main meeting was effectively really 4 days, Monday through Thursday, but increasingly it looks like Friday is going to be a fairly full day. I only mention that because that was a subject of some discussion, I think, in the ITF plenary this time round. About the use of Friday. Some people say about it impinged on their weekends if they couldn't travel back on Friday during the daytime, although that didn't get a lot of sympathy from any in-person participants from Australia or New Zealand, who basically said
I was about to say that didn't go down well with the guy from New Zealand who was like, it's going to take me 27 hours to get home. Like you and your 2 or 3 hour flights can
yes, or even West US, a bit amateur in comparison. So yeah, he wasn't especially sympathetic to not taking full use of the Friday. But anyway, a range of opinions were expressed, so we'll see how that goes. But I think just given the pressure of sort of 4 slots through the week, I don't think there's really any choice at the moment other than making better use of Friday than previously. Anyway, I digress. All of the recordings, as far as I could tell, are all up and clickable through the agenda, so you can get at any of those now. Most of the meeting minutes seem to be up as well. Not all of them. There are a few still to be done, but the majority that I looked at certainly were available. And for context also, but by the end of the meeting we had just a few under 1,600 people registered to attend, of which roughly 3/5, 1,000 were in person, and just under 600 were remote. So one of the larger meetings by 150 or so compared to some of the other recent ones. So good turnout. And also a reminder, Jay, the exec director of the IETF, pushed out a message earlier today encouraging people to do the post-meeting survey. So if you did attend either in person or remote, please fill out the survey if you've not already done so. Apparently, as of this morning, it only had about 70 responses, which 70 out of the 1,600 isn't great. I think he's keen to get a few more. And one of the things which is covered on there is feedback on the all dispatch experiment, which we'll come to in a bit. So if you have any strong feelings on that either way, you can express those in the post-meeting survey if you've not already done it. Okay, so as I say, I will shamelessly cherry pick a few things. If you want to jump in with any other observations, probably best to interrupt me as we go along, so your interruption is in the context of the time when it happened. I'm just going to run through these in chronological order. So on the Sunday, where we had the welcome reception, the thing I'll mention, because I'm somewhat biased, is during the IEPG, so the Internet Engineering and Planning Group, which takes place by tradition, I think, 10 till 12 on the Sunday morning of the meeting. Did include a presentation and discussion about the use of ECH, Encrypted Client Hello. That's the extension to TLS 1.3, just as a reminder, which I gave a presentation on that in the context of the implications for network operators, with some input from one of my document co-authors, Paul Vixie, who was in Dublin elsewhere and sort of joined us for that particular slot, and provoked a few interesting sort of points for and against from the floor. So I've mentioned that on the call previously, so if you've not had a chance to look at it, the recording's available. It's for the whole of the IPG slot, and that presentation was roughly 81 minutes into the recording. So you can look at that at your leisure.
Thanks for sharing that, Andrew. I started watching it and got interrupted, but I'm looking forward to watching the whole thing.
Excellent. And there was what were comments from at least, well, I think from one CISO or former CISO, which was encouraging, because good to have someone with a sort of operational perspective in the room in Dublin, rather than more from a sort of more theoretical point of view. So yeah, any comments when you've had a chance to finish watching it, Darren? Much appreciated.
Sure.
Okay, and then into the meeting proper. So from the Monday, as I'm just going to pull out a few things from across the different slots that I went to. Deleg, if I'm honest, I lost my notes from that, but from memory, it felt like a reasonably cordial discussion, and I think the impression I came away with was that the working group is making some progress. It's early days, but and they're still developing the requirements document, which will help set out what problem or problems the working group is trying to solve. Not all fully sort of thrashed out yet, but it does feel like it's moving forward, which as I couldn't locate my notes for that, but that was my impression. So anyone with better recollection or better notes, feel free to jump in, like I hope Michael is about to.
Yeah, I would go further than that. I would say that the requirements seem quite stable among the group after the virtual interim. And then there was this long conversation about, as you might recall, about what was it called? Deleg versus type mechanism, right? And
yes, you're quite right. I forgot that.
And we had a whole back and forth of, are we ready to decide? And I was actually quite surprised that people went for the architecturally purer solution, even though it might take us longer, because I thought people were going to be more pragmatically just get her done kind of thing. And I don't have a horse to ride on that one, but I was more on the pragmatic side, but delighted that we're going to do it architecturally pure, I guess. But Carl, you are nodding vigorously.
Yeah, I was just agreeing that there was, as you say, quite that discussion between the type and the name variant, and I have to say my vote was for the type, for exactly exactly the reasons you outlined. That it just felt more architecturally pure, even if it was going to be slightly slower. And that's both with kind of a DNS hat on, but also with a, there was also discussion about, we need to think about both the implementation in the authoritative side as well as the implementation in the recursive side. And I'm glad somebody else made the point and saved me needing to get up and walk to the mic, because my brain was going, yeah, don't forget about the registry operators who will need to make alterations to their systems to store these records, and there will no doubt be knock-on effects into EPP and potentially RDAP as well for display and alteration of those records by registrars, etc., etc. So yeah.
Wonder if perhaps it's a reflection on there's a good cross section of experience within the working group, operationally as well as in terms of software development, which is helpful. And maybe a few people have perhaps been burned before by maybe taking the odd shorter, more convenient route, and then had to do a lot of rework later. So yeah, maybe it's also pragmatism on purely in terms of do it once rather than do it quickly and come to regret it later. Maybe I'm speculating, but I suspect it's mainly just because of the good cross section of knowledge and experience within the group, mainly. Okay, well, it's good that we're. Thank you for jogging my memory. Actually, I've forgotten that whole sort of bit of that this discussion, Michael. And
word
Carlos.
is repressed. You repressed that memory.
Indeed. Okay, next one I'm going to call out, and as I say, if I missed stuff that was a highlight for you, or you think is worthy of comment, everyone jump in as we go along. But next one for me, session 2 on Tuesday, I went to ModPod, Moderation Procedures, which is effectively looking at moderation of things like the lists and so on, behaviour within the community, would be my unofficial sort of short description of it. My sort of takeout from the discussion overall was it felt like there was a reasonable amount of consensus, not 100% to be fair, that something needed to be done, but not clear yet what the consensus is on what should be done, and more specifically by whom. I think there was some views that it could be done by the Secretariat, under the auspices of the exec director. Others felt it should be owned and done by the community, whatever it was, which, as I say, wasn't completely clear at this stage. There was some dissension, mainly by a remote participant, and so this is things like behaviour moderation. Peter just responding to the comment in the chat. So things like people expressing opinions in ways that perhaps are frowned upon when you look at the actual sort of note well and note very well work, which specifies what is and isn't acceptable within the community. And I think it's fair to say there are a wide range of views as to what should be acceptable, shall we say, rather than what is. And it was slightly unfortunate that one of the people that was dissenting from some of the discussion happened to be remote and seemed to be struggling at points with their connection. I don't know if he was tongue-in-cheek. He was saying he was being censored in expressing his views because they weren't coming through in the chat for example. So I don't know if that was tongue in cheek or serious. It did give me a funny mental image of a darkened room full of hundreds of people doing real-time content moderation on the chat, which I'm sure Jay would love to have that level of resourcing, but that isn't something which is a thing. So I think it was just the connection was cutting out at bad times occasionally, which was
Right.
maybe funny, but not censorship, I don't believe. But yeah, so my take was there's some work to be done to nail down more clearly what a hard proposal is. It's not a major problem based on the stats where the list moderators have had to jump in, although some of the work looking at culture within the community suggests it's perhaps a bigger problem than just the raw stats suggest, but who knows? So I think that will be refined over the next meeting or so, and no doubt with further discussion on the list, etc. I don't know if anyone on this call managed to get to the BOF, the high performance wide area network BOF, which was looking at how to handle extremely high volumes of data over the internet rather than private networks. And if you've got any reflections on that. So I'll pause for a second to see if anybody did.
No, I had my registry hat on at that point and went to regex instead.
Fair enough. I'll work on the basis you don't have anything specific to say about that, Carl, but if you do, feel free to share if you feel it was noteworthy in any way. And same for anybody else, as I say.
I think more interesting actually than so regex was certainly interesting. There's a bunch of stuff going through there about EPP. They're drafting a couple of RFCs to do EPP over QUIC and EPP over HTTPS. So there's a bunch of discussion there. But there was also an interesting which is coming up on your slide, which will be on one of your next slides. Around RPP and a whole discussion around a RESTful provisioning protocol.
Yes, which you're right, is coming up. I can't remember what day of the week it was, but yes, one of the other BOFs, of course. Okay, all right. Well, that's a good segue then to move on. So then we had the all dispatch session, which I mentioned the ISG is seeking feedback on. So if you complete the post-meeting survey, you have a chance to give your views on that. So let me just click down because I put a few comments on that. Hopefully, I just took these from the meeting minutes. This is just a summary of the documents that were covered within all dispatch. I'm not going to read these out loud. You can scan through these either now or at your leisure post call, but it just summarizes what was covered and the decision that was taken as to what, if anything, to do next with it. The impression I had is although there's still a few sort of wrinkles to work through, that seems to be serving a useful purpose by distilling into one session things that would have been spread over multiple different smaller dispatch groups in covering the different areas of the IETF, and it did mean that a lot more people got to scrutinize the things that were being discussed in one place rather than being spread a lot more thinly in other places. And the chairing has got slicker. They were trying to keep the discussions down to 10 minutes per topic, and I think mainly successfully, and where possible to focus the discussion principally on what to do next, where to dispatch the topic to, did it warrant further work within the IETF, and if so, where, or if not, should we just ignore it, or was there an alternate fora that would be more appropriate? And you'll see, for example, third bullet down, high assurance DIDs with DNS was recommendation was that would be a better fit with W3C than the IETF. Clearly, we can't dispatch something to another standards body, but we can at least point the authors in the right direction. Or similarly, fifth bullet down, a proposal by Dan Wing on identifying and authenticating home servers, where the suggestion was to hold a BOF and potentially go to the IRTF. So it doesn't have to go to the IETF, for example, as an outcome. I think technically we can't dispatch things to the IETF, but make a recommendation. But Kathleen might come in with a much more informed point of view on any or all of the above. So Kathleen, do come in.
Thank you, Andrew. My question from sitting in the session was how many people read the drafts in advance? Because the outcomes were steered by those that speak, which, makes sense. But it wasn't clear to me that more than 3 people read the drafts.
Always tried to read the drafts, especially these ones, well in advance. And I think where there's some timing of some of this made it very difficult.
That's Michael, right?
That's Michael speaking. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And I normally do too, but I used to be a chair. And so since I'm not, the SEC dispatch chair, I didn't read all the drafts in advance. So I wasn't sure if the steering is what it should be. Right. And are we really getting what we want out of this session? Because it really goes to the viewpoint of those that put the time in. And they know that. Right. So how effective this is really depends on the community.
That's fair. And now you've said that, Kathleen, I don't remember any discussion in the meeting to encourage people, okay, I know it's an experiment, but maybe make that point that this works best if people have read the drafts in advance. So to really, maybe that should be said at every one of those meetings. I know not everyone reads all of the drafts for all of the sort of working group sessions, but maybe these ones in particular, that's a very fair comment.
It can really skew the outcomes, right? So you have a big opportunity to lead the direction of new work in the IETF by ensuring that you read those drafts. And if people aren't doing that, then we're going to get a skewed view.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. And maybe that would have been a good thing for the meeting chairs to really sort of push. Who knows? I mean, maybe that'd be something that'd be useful for the ISG to say. Well, if they decide to continue in this format, they could make that recommendation to really encourage people to read these in particular. Because you make a good point that if something's going to be dispatched for further work, it would be a shame if it's based on the opinions of 2 or 3 people rather than a reasonable cross section of the community. So that'd be a good thing to put in your post-meeting survey if you've not already done it.
I haven't. So yes, I can do that, and I can drop a note to Roman and Deb maybe, since I do my work in this, and Paul, since that's where I usually do my work, is security area.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, which would be good. Yeah.
On the specific item of the home server, so Dan was unaware, and this is kind of sad. Of that, there's been a lot of work that has happened around the IETF in IOTSF and IoT Ops working group about this, with a lot of different proposals and sort of no winner. And so a BOF will be interesting, but I actually think I believe it should belong back in either a new working group or in IoT Ops. And it's also possible that it's not solvable.
Yeah. Which will be the first time say it's not been solvable, which we may come on to in a minute, one of the other ones. But so anyone that didn't go to this, in my view, it's a good one to look at the recording for. If just to sort of see some of the things that have been pitched to the community for to take on as new work, just to give you a flavour of things that are sort of coming in through the front door.
And
as it were.
if I could also, on this privacy.txt, when security.txt came out, it was just as controversial, but it didn't get stopped at the phase that it got stopped at this meeting.
Yeah, which was the ultimate bullet. Sorry, just scanning down the list. Yeah. So the one from Louise van der Peet, who, if I recall, actually, she, I think, was a student. Was she a student? It was her first meeting. So some of the comments could have been more encouraging, I feel.
Well, I tried to front end that. I'm not sure if you saw in the chat, but I put a very polite and friendly comment that said, "Oh, it appears it's her first meeting." And then the chairs chimed in very quickly and said, "Kathleen means be nice."
Yes. That's what I'm.
So that was.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if the right outcome happened there. Right. And I didn't speak up other than to ask people to be nice, because I didn't take the time myself I didn't have the time to read that draft.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what others on this call think, and if there is a difference, and you can contact me offline or follow up another time, maybe more about it. But I am a bit curious, are we getting to the right decisions? Thank you.
If anyone has an opinion on that now, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, particularly if you weren't able to attend it, have a look at the recording, and then do please sort of share your views as to whether it's the right approach, and, as Kathleen quite rightly said, and most importantly, whether we're getting to the right sorts of outcomes. My bias is I think it's the right approach, and we'll probably need more refinement, but it's better than the alternatives. But other opinions, and no doubt will be out there as well on that. Okay, let me move on. Digital emblems was the next one that I went to, the digital emblems BOF. On the Tuesday morning. So this is trying to give a digital equivalent of, I use the Red Cross example because the sort of Red Cross, Red Crescent, etc. were in attendance in Dublin as one of the supporters, if that's the right sort of phrase, of what a key use case for this. It's trying to find a way to mark sort of digital sort of territory as being sort of property of, let's say, the Red Cross, and therefore protected under sort of various aspects of I think it's international human rights law. So if were you to be an attacker and proceed to attack even the digital sort of property of the Red Cross, you would be sort of breaking that law. As opposed to if attacking something of an actual adversary. So that's, if you like, the sort of use case which kicked this off. Then other use cases, I think, came into the last BOF where this was first discussed in IETF 120, and this was a continuation. It still felt like there were differing views what the right use case was, and whether it be appropriate to charter a working group just with a single use case, or maybe make this the first use case but with the potential to expand onto others, or make it a sole use case and then require a charter amendment were the work to continue onwards to look at other sort of related areas. So it felt like that still hadn't been concluded, and it felt like that was to be continued on the list post-meeting. So I think it's an interesting area, and it was good to see some additional sort of parts of civil society engaging in the standards process, albeit And I think there were various people, not just from the Red Cross, but from other elements of that community, who'd made the efforts to come in person to Dublin. So it's good to see them there. I suspect they probably went away a little bit frustrated that we after sort of 2 goes, we still hadn't got to agreeing how to approach this. But there seemed, I think my impression was, seemed to be an interest on the whole, that this was a problem worth trying to solve, albeit they were not 100% true. There were a few dissenters in the discussion, but overall seemed to be a majority in favour of trying to do something. But most of the discussion was whether to just try and do this or simply take it on as one of multiple use cases. I will carry on, but interrupt me if you want to come in with other points of view, either on anything I've covered or anything I don't cover. But continue on Tuesday, I went to the IAB Open, which again covered a range of interesting things. Ones that caught my attention were there's a whole discussion on how we do liaison with other standards development organisations. My take is we don't do it that well, and there's plenty of room for improvement. My sense was not all of the IAB would agree with that statement, but there were some others who had some frustrations with the current approach. And then separately, there's in my view, a pretty decent summary of the recent workshops on the Global Digital Compact. I forgot his name, but one of the people from the Internet Society, one of their senior team, gave a summary in 15, well, less than 15 minutes of that whole area, which again is quite complex. I think he did a pretty good job about getting it across in a very small amount of time. So I was quite impressed how he summarised it. There was other things covered, but those are the 2 that jumped out at me. And again, I will continue on. Pending any interruptions. ADD, so adaptive DNS discovery, good discussion where we continue to make progress. Nothing really jumped out at me from that I thought was especially noteworthy, which is not a criticism, but I'll pause in case anyone had any specific reflections. Otherwise, I will plough on. To say also on Tuesday in the evening, as a non-IETF sort of thing, or at least not on the main agenda, the Irish Internet Exchange, INEX, hosted a meeting just over the river from the conference centre, titled "The Internet's Past, Gateway to the Future," which is really interesting. I think some of the people on this call managed to get there. I think there were a few of us that managed to sort of catch a ticket. Well attended, and the format was really good. Basically, a well-known Irish sort of tech journalist, Colin Livingstone, hosted a discussion with Paul Vixie, Maria Farrell, and Jim Cowie. Really just got some reminiscences on things that perhaps with hindsight they might do differently, or equally things that they felt needed to be tackled. And there were some fantastic analogies with natural systems, for example, comparing the internet ecosystem to, say, natural ecosystems, where they say basically that with natural ecosystems you keep all of the carbohydrates in stasis, but just being shared by the predators in the food chain. They keep getting recycled back around and around, unlike the internet at the moment, where a lot of the sort of energy is being sort of taken out by some players and not recycled back in to continue the sort of circle of life, as it were. So just sort of questioning whether the current model is sustainable in the very long term, and should there be more efforts to sort of rewild the internet and take it back to something which is more diversified and long term a lot more sustainable than the current model. So I don't think it was recorded. It wasn't obviously being recorded, which is a pity, because it was a really interesting sort of reflections from the sort of three main protagonists, and it definitely was well worth going to. There wasn't remote access or anything, but it was a good thing to see. So, but hard to summarise as an experience if you weren't there in the room. Again, I just pause in case anyone else was there and has perhaps got a slightly more coherent perspective on it you want to just quickly toss in. No one's jumping in, so maybe not. But I'd be interested to see if someone does something similar to that the next meeting. It was definitely a good session, albeit it clashed with some of the main agenda. But just clicked on the link rather than forwarding the slide. Okay, moving on, jumping around a bit. DOLT, detecting unwanted location trackers, the back end or the beginning of Wednesday. That was a BOF as sort of move. I think in the last meeting it became a sort of fully fledged working group. It still felt like sort of early days. Well, it is early days, to be fair, for the working group. This is all about identifying sort of air tags or similar devices that have been planted about your person, perhaps without your knowledge, or that have been enabled on something that that you have about you, so you can be tracked perhaps by an oppressive partner without your knowledge, and potentially detect them and then disable them. But I think from some of the discussion, people are beginning to realise this is a complex topic. For example, someone made the point, well, what happens if I'm sat on a plane with a whole bunch of other people? Will their trackers that they may have for their luggage or their keys or whatever show up as unwanted trackers on me, and me be prompted to disable them and then mine, etc. So yeah, interesting discussion, but I think the working group's starting to realise how complex the topic this is, and where some of the contradictions are. So I think it's going to take a while before anything useful comes out, would be my sort of sense of it. There are definitely some contradictions there, but let's see how it evolves.
A major problem was surfaced in that the hardware vendor isn't necessarily going to be able to increase the specs to accommodate some of what's been put into the forward-looking specs. So they have to sort through that too.
Yes, so things like visual identifiers or audible identifiers, that sort of thing. Having a physical serial number printed on the device, and so on. So it'd be quite difficult to make it backwards compatible, for sure.
I think that my opinion is that they're all the existing ones are going to go in the garbage, because it only works with remote attestation, and I don't think any of them are capable of that, or even if they physically are, have deployed that. So you need to know that the device is actually running the right software, and because if it's not, it's just a stealth, device.
Yeah.
And I don't know how the incentives align yet, except that I think that people who find trackers that they don't recognize, who aren't behaving, even if, as you say, it's on an airplane, blah, blah, they will discover that these remote trackers are, these devices are, been destroyed. People will just nope, I don't know what they are. It's not behaving right. I'm just destroying it. Tough.
Yes. Yeah, there was some discussion, wasn't there, in the room, Michael, about how you could perhaps retain the data for future forensic examination versus, well, I've just stamped on it, sorry. Which pragmatism might prevail there, rather than worrying about the long-term identifying who planted it on you, etc. If you're that bothered, stopping it is probably the top of your list of things to do, more than anything more sophisticated than that.
And then maybe the airplanes will have trackers that say, I'm an airplane, you're on an airplane, and everything else should be.
Yeah.
Right. That's how you deal with that fact that, or, you're apparently Uber drivers love trackers because it tells them before the people get out of the vehicle whether the people taking all their shit with them.
Rather than, oh, could we just go back?
Right. Exactly. It's like, no, it says there's still something in my car. So, I'm not leaving until you get all your stuff out of my car. Right?
Yes. Yeah, that's fair. Having had to call a driver back not that long ago for that very reason. Yeah, that's a good very good use case. Okay, right, let's press on. Okay, DNRG, the decentralization of the Internet Research Group. To summarize the whole discussion, it covered a range of good presentations, well worth looking at. They're very thoughtful, as it has been in the last few meetings. It's fair to say Jeff Houston, who was sort of joined remotely because he broke several of his ribs, which prevented him coming to Europe for OARC and RIPE and IETF and no doubt other things. So he was rather grumpy, questioning whether there was anything other than just basic economics sort of driving all of the centralization of the internet. And he made references to a number of industries over the last 150 years that have gone through very similar cycles to that the internet is currently going through, and questioned whether anyone actually had any hard evidence to show that it was more than just economics, which is a good sort of reminder that for a research group we need to have evidence and data, not just opinions. So it was a good challenge, and I think further work required to prove one way or the other whether that's true. Again, jumping through to Thursday, and I skipped a couple in the afternoon on Wednesday because I had to do an interview for the LLC for one of the non-com roles, which overlap with two of the afternoon sessions on Thursday. On Thursday in the morning, I got the Scone working group, which again relatively recently formed, having been a BOF. There's still work to be done to really pin down whether there's one or maybe multiple use cases and solutions. There are potentially 3 competing solutions, 2 of which have got more traction than the other one thus far in the working group. And as a consequence, the chairs were proposing in the meeting to schedule monthly virtual interims between 121 and 122, so at least 3 of those realistically, to try and get to a more defined position for the working group. So it's still really grappling with that, and clearly needs to get to a solution on or get to clarity on that before they can make sort of real progress. I mean, that said, there were some fairly well-defined potential solutions, but not agreement yet which was the right approach, or whether they could be merged in some way, or whether there was a different and better way of doing it. And that's all about signaling from a network to endpoints that there might be bandwidth restrictions, perhaps because of actual limited bandwidth on the link, or imposed limits, say by a service provider, and give the application on a voluntary basis the opportunity to consume the signal and maybe amend its behavior, to potentially use less bandwidth or do something slightly different, but say purely on a voluntary basis. But still not got the right basis to make progress yet there. DNS ops. sort of part two session. I went to that on the sort of Thursday later in the afternoon, as I said, I had to miss a couple for the interviews. That was a sort of generally good session, mainly positive. The main there's an interesting discussion, for example, on the integration of DNS domain names into application environments. The only real negativity that I noted down was a sort of presentation on the local sort of TLD, which I think it was a pretty innocuous presentation, but got some strongly negative feedback from a couple of people, to the extent Warren Kamari, the AD, sort of joined the queue to thank the IANA, I think, for this, for what they'd done, because they'd done what they'd been asked to do, because they got some flack. So got some flack from people in the mic queue, which felt slightly out of context and maybe not entirely consistent with the note. Well, maybe borderline, but yeah, that was the new TLD that came in, but purely for private use. So it was an information update which got a bit pushback from a couple of people. And then, yeah, TLS middle of Friday. There was some discussion about the FAT group. If you're not following TLS, that's a formal analysis triage team, which has generated some controversy within the TLS working group. This is basically having a small group of experts review things to see whether they need formal analysis. I wouldn't say there's complete consensus yet on that within the TLS working group. Seem to be some views expressed that the reason for having this group discuss things, review things sort of slightly offline from the main working group was because the sort of atmosphere was too potentially critical if they did it as part of the sort of the mainstream group. And you could sort of see maybe that being expressed in some of the feedback that's come up, not just in this session in Dublin, but also previously in the last meeting and in Vancouver, and also on the mailing list in between. So some strong views expressed over the last few months. There's also an interesting proposal which I don't think came up in Dublin, but popped up on the main list post meeting about TLS 1.2 long-term support and doing some mods to TLS 1.2 to fix some known problems that had been sort of parked whilst TLS 1.3 was developed. And there's a proposal that dates back about 8 years, which its backer wants to just get the group to adopt and take forward as to give a more sustainable, a more sound, if you like, version of TLS 1.2, particularly for embedded devices and so on, where they're not likely to be updated for TLS 1.3, or in some cases can't be because they're not capable of being updated. So just throw that in as a sort of a bonus point. And that was it from me. So I'll pause there in case anyone thinks I've done a major injustice to something else that was really important that you picked up on through the week. And if so, now's your chance to jump in or pop something in the chat if that's easier.
I wondered if you or anybody else on the call had any thoughts on, if you attended the DNS op, the second one that you mentioned. Warren had to join the queue, etc., etc. Fujiwara-san made the presentation around limits for various types of records and what have you, and I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on that.
I know I don't, Carl. I think there was some skepticism whether the limits he proposed were the right ones by some people, from my recollection. But I don't know if, did anyone else pick up on that with any thoughts? Or if you don't have any.
Andrew.
Hi, Gianpaolo.
Yeah, so given related to ECH, given the fact that DNS is the transporter for your ECH key sharing, and ECH is not quantum safe. In this case, wondering if any update to ECH that will consider having keys quantum safe will fit in a shorter record.
Well, that wasn't part of the limits, but I don't recall that coming up. There was some discussion about quantum safe algorithms for DNSSEC. I mean, TLS groups seem to be taking a longer term view of when that's needed, although they are looking at mixed keys at the moment. I think in certainly the mailing list. But with differing views how quickly they're needed and whether they should have pure or mixed or hybrid sort of options. And I think Kathleen may have put, in fact, it's in the headlines. I can't remember the exact context there. There's a NIST paper also on this, which sort of touches on that. So bear with us on that, and I'll see if I can quickly get to that in a second, Gianpaolo. But it wasn't discussed, I don't think, in the working in Dublin, to answer your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I take it no one else had any other thoughts on the limits question that Carl posed. So if you perhaps pick up afterwards, if you haven't seen the presentation and watched the recording, maybe share something on the mailing list, that'd be most welcome. Okay, we got 5 minutes to go, so I will just very briefly move on, if I may. Just in terms of the news headline, so some of you would have got these in your inbox this morning. If you didn't and want to be added to the mailing list, tell me and I'll happily add you. There's a few different things which I'll mention. As always, the threats team at Infoblox pick up some interesting stuff, do a lot of interesting research, and they've sort of identified over 1 million domains that could be vulnerable to domain hijacking. So definitely worth reading that article if you're interested in vulnerabilities, which is clearly what that's about. Also, the ICANN team, I think not just the office of the CTO, but including them, did a series of presentations. I think there were at least 3 at ICANN 81 last week, touching on blockchain name technologies. So alternative to the DNS, if you will, by the use of naming systems linked to the blockchain. So there's at least 3 sessions plus some useful background slides. So I put links to those there. I'll skip through these because I'm sure I will find the thing that I'm thinking of, which Kathleen mentioned. Yes, so second last on this screen. So the one of the IETF working groups is seeking feedback on a draft on post-quantum cryptography. You'll see, because I think it's got a wider application than just for protocol engineers. And rather helpfully, I saw on, I think it was on LinkedIn, that Kathleen had highlighted that, but also put a link to a NIST document that has come out within the last few weeks. On the same topic, which is useful background on this. I'm looking at when post-quantum may be needed for different types of encryption. So worth a look if you've not already picked up on that.
The key request too was to get different reviewers, not the usual people. And so that's why I had posted it, because I have a number of students that are working and hit some of the categories they were asking for. So you might be on this call and think, oh, that's not me, but it might be. So, they're looking for people outside of their typical review group.
Which is a good thing for the IETF to want people with other experiences to contribute. So hope they get a positive response to that.
Yeah, make it more generally accessible for this document.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just quickly scroll back. Since ECH came up, 40OS has done a feature update, which you'll see. This is the top bullet on this chart. Adds support to control TLS connections that utilize ECH with options to block, allow, or force the client to switch to a non-ECH TLS connection by modifying the DO responses. It'd be interesting to see whether other software or when other software starts to add features to manage the ECH in an enterprise environment, which clearly 40OS is very much beginning to do there, leading the way. And then a couple of other things just briefly. There's a useful summary from a Ditchley Foundation 2-day conference on internet governance, and also the European Commission is running a consultation on internet governance and looking for feedback on that. So links there should you be interested to do so. And as we're almost on the hour, within the next few seconds, there's a whole bunch of other things, but no time to go through them in a whole range of different areas, so I won't do those. There are some deadlines coming up, but I think the nearest is this time next week, which is but a few things coming up over the next few weeks, including grants and other stuff. So again, have a look at those at your leisure. And if you don't get the email, drop me a message and I'll add you to the mailing list. That's it from me. Have a fantastic rest of the week, and hopefully catch up with you same time next week. So see you all then, but enjoy the week in the meantime. Thanks all.